Boa tarde. Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Today, we will discuss the Brazilian financial and capital markets. Hope you all enjoy it. My name is Eduardo. I'm a partner at PwC Brasil with a focus on financial services. I'm here with my colleague, Claudia.
Hello, my name is Claudia. I'm a senior manager at PwC Brasil. Good afternoon. Boa tarde.
Just a few admin points before we start. The session is being recorded and will be shared with all participants in the next days. Please send to us your question. I think it's important. You can send during the event, and after that, we're gonna choose some of the questions to answer. And do not forget, follow PwC Brasil on social media. Let's start, Claudia. Let's talk a little bit on Brazil.
The Brazilian capital market has never been before so enthusiastic, even with the global COVID crisis. The Brazilian Stock Exchange, B3, has been registering record levels of IPOs and follow-ons with levels not seen since 2007. There were 53 IPOs and follow-ons in 2020, and already 21 IPOs and follow-ons in the first quarter of 2021, with a further 54 IPOs forecast until the end of this year. That means a total of 75 IPOs and follow-ons in 1 year. The Brazilian Stock Exchange has grown by $30 billion in the last 12 months. A total of 425 companies are registered at the stock exchange, and the main driver here is the interest rate being at an historical low and a greater number of individuals registered as a stock exchange, seeking for alternatives to more conservative investments. Here's a glance at the news to illustrate the situation of the Brazilian capital market. Copom, that's the National Monetary Council, cuts interest rates to 3.75%, new historic low. Stock exchange is the highest number of IPOs since 2007, and the wave of offers is expected to continue in 2021. Selic rate, Brazilian federal funds rate, drops to 2% per annum, the lowest in history, with a new cut of 0.25 points. Ibovespa breaks record after taking off more than 92% in just 9 months.
Great. So now I think we can talk on funds in Brazil. Currently, funds are divided in two different kinds. Structured funds and non-structured funds that we call 555 funds. They are used mainly for investments in listed stocks, private and public bonds, and for sure in other funds. In general, they are more likely to be invested by individuals than professional or qualified investors. On the other hand, we have the structured funds, FIP, FIDICs, and FII. So what we call in Portuguese, FIP, FIDIC, and FII. FIP is our private equity fund. The FIP are the preferred investment vehicles for foreign investors, allowing 3 different investors to hold interest in Brazil, to hold interest in Brazilian companies, and do not pay any capital gain tax on disposal. Of course, for this exemption, certain requirements will need to be met. The FIDIC, our fund dedicated to invest in receivables of all kinds. The FIDICs are becoming more and more popular here in Brazil. It permits a more efficient funding by companies which hold the receivables in their assets. If structured in a certain way, can permit several benefits in terms of tax. For foreign and domestic investor, 15% should be applicable on distribution. In the end, we have FII in Portuguese, Brazilian Rich, our real estate fund. It intends to finance not only real estate, but also financial instruments that finance the real estate market. If certain requirements are met, again, it guarantees some benefits. If listed, for example, there is an exemption on distribution of proceeds. But we are changing that. Our Brazilian SEC is planning some changes in the fund industry. What's great? It should make Brazilian reality closer, even closer to what we can see abroad. It should make our capital markets even more competitive. Recently, we're facing some issues regarding responsibility of managers and administrators, mainly in terms of tax and the UBO rules imposed by Brazilian tax authorities. The limitation in the managers and administrators' responsibility would be very positive here in our market. Another change that could bring some discussion is regarding quota holders' responsibility that should be proportional to the numbers of quotas. That's important. It's still under discussion, but this alternative should not be available for all types of funds, but just for some. We can see what we can see in FIDIC, 2 different types of quotas we're going to have for the other types of funds. The implication of this is to have different rights, obligation, and segregated equities for each one. The ISIN code will be mandatory. I will repeat. The ISIN code will be mandatory in line with what we have in the main markets abroad. But there is another change that we're going to have, that the market is planning, that could bring more safety and more simplicity to our market. Claudia, what do you have in terms of bill of exchange? Could you say a little bit?
Thanks, Ido. The Brazilian Central Bank sent the proposed exchange bill of law to the parliament. This proposal aims at modernizing the foreign exchange market and internationalizing the Brazilian financial market. There are 3 steps to follow. First, simplify, then internationalize, to then thirdly, get to a 100% convertible currency. That's why the proposed bill was based on 3 pillars. The first pillar means a focus on adjusting the regulatory requirements in accordance with the risks and values involved, abandoning some bureaucratic processes that do not add relevant security or whose compliance costs are not proportionate to their benefits. Secondly, consolidation. This is demonstrated by bringing together more than 40 legal norms that are currently dispersed over several laws and sometimes even making each other obsolete, which increases legal insecurity and does not contemplate the technological changes underway and the current needs of the Brazilian economy. And finally, modernization. The proposal is meant to promote competition, transparency, and financial inclusion. We see this, for example, in a prediction that fintechs do not necessarily have to be linked to brokers or banks to operate in the foreign exchange market, which is something that is currently required.
So let's go. Requiring the same registration process and obligation to small and institutional investors represents isolation from the rest of the world, where people seek simpler ways of doing their investments. The bill of exchange should allow several chains and a wider simplification for foreigners to access the Brazilian capital markets. As you can see, there are several steps to be in compliance in order to do investments in Brazil. A simplification in this process would be very positive. So that complex process that we saw in the previous slide would be simplified into this one. These changes will be allowed by the Bill of Exchange, allowing the Brazilian Central Bank to maintain clearing, settlement, custody accounts of institutions domiciled abroad, would bring benefits to the market in Brazil. Claudia, so could you please introduce our speakers?
Yes, let me introduce you to our speakers of today. Álvaro Tallar is a mentor and senior advisor to startups and corporations that focus on innovation. Pedro is a director of Anbima, the Brazilian Financial and Capital Markets Association, and a founding partner of Lebanon Equities. And Guilherme is a director of tax at Phoenix Tower International.
We have to remember that we have important information here. Tallar was a PwC partner just months ago. Claudia, let's go to the first question. And Tallar, it will be for you.
Sure. In order to invest in the Brazilian financial and capital markets, one of the main steps that a non-resident investor needs to take is providing the so-called 4373 account, which determines the need to nominate legal, tax, and custodian representatives. Now, since October last year, under a new resolution from the Brazilian Monetary Council, individual investors no longer have an obligation to designate a custodian. Also, the resolution determines that the Brazilian SEC is responsible for regulating the procedures required for registration with the authority and may even exempt the investors from the obligation to register, although no measures have been announced yet. Tallar, my first question to you, do you believe this could help to reduce the costs and bureaucracy to non-residents when aiming to invest in Brazil?
Thank you, Claudia, for the question. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be back to the house that I worked for more than 30 years. In fact, it's a pleasure to be back here. And in fact, some of these topics we are discussing today were the type of topics I worked with most of my career in PwC as a financial service expert. And probably one of the last projects I worked with was the one together with Anbima, that Pedro, our friend Pedro, is here and will be able to comment on the Anbima's perspective. But PwC supported a type of a study to identify the topics we would need to implement to become feasible and cheaper for small investors to come into the Brazilian financial market. This new, Claudia, that you mentioned about allowing foreign individuals to invest without the need for a second custodian is a great news, but probably not enough. We'll talk today, maybe the next minutes as well, in the next questions as well, about the other type of topics we need to implement as soon as this FX law is approved, is valid. But important to say that the regulators are very open to discuss and to improve. They know how important it is for the Brazilian market, economy, and financial market to receive, let's say, investment for thousands or maybe, why not, hundreds of thousands or individual investors or small investors that could, for example, decide to send from their retiree savings $500, $500 into the Brazilian market to buy one specific stock or maybe government bonds. And saying that, I have to say that Brazilian tax regime for foreign investors is very good. I think probably most of you know that if you come through the 4373 account, you can get full exemption on government bonds. You can get full exemption on capital gains on stock. Currently, there is also no withholding on dividend in Brazil. And you can also get reduced rates for private bonds. You can get reduced rates for derivatives. So pretty much good, but unfortunately not enough. It's interesting, to know that, for example, even a Brazilian individual that maybe decide to move to a foreign country to live abroad, I would say either in Portugal or maybe Florida in United States, many Brazilians there in those two locations, but they really leave Brazil as a tax resident. So they're not Brazilian tax resident anymore, and they decide to invest back in Brazil. Or maybe they already have some investments in Brazil. Should they benefit from this tax regime? They would say it's possible, but they need to open a 4373 account. And the costs of a 4373 account could be maybe hundreds of, sorry, not the cost, but the minimum amount to be allowed to open and to pay off for a 4373 account might be having a minimum portfolio of hundreds of thousands of US dollars. So I'm sure that not most of our potential investors would have that amount. So that's why we need to improve to benefit even more the Brazilian attractiveness for foreign investor. I'm sure that we'll have other opportunities to discuss with you in this call about that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Tayar. If you guys have any comments on that, Pedro and Guilherme, feel free. So let's keep talking on that. In Brazil, the first formal procedure for a company to go public is to file a request for registration at the Brazilian SEC. At the same time, for the company to have its shares and other securities traded, it must be requested to be listed in our Brazilian stock exchange, B3. In 2020, over $23 billion were raised among IPOs and follow-ons. It's important to highlight that at the beginning of this year, the interest rate was at its historically lowest level, and it remains lower than 3 up to now. That's one of the reasons that stimulated Brazilians' search for alternatives and portfolio diversification. For example, investing listed equities. Guilherme, I have a question for you. In terms of the economy, what are the factors that benefits investments in Brazil, in your opinion? In terms of tax structuring, what do you believe were the important changes in the last years?
Thanks, Eduardo, and thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I also have to mention that I worked for PwC for several years before joining PTI. And for sure, I think we have discussed that here before. The reduction and stabilization of the public interest rates in Brazil, but also we have seen that in the US and some other jurisdictions for sure increase the appetite of the investors for new markets, and Brazil for sure is one of them. We also have to mention the discussions on the structural reforms, right? So we have been discussing the tax and fiscal reforms. They're also relevant to attract non-resident investors in Brazil. We mentioned a little bit earlier today the definition of the UBO rules, so the ultimate beneficial owner, which demonstrates that the local markets are seeking a more professional approach, which is aligned with the global market practice. Brazil has been also flirting in adopting some of the main guidelines for OECD, which is also another good sign that Brazil is looking for a global alignment. I remember when we had the first UBO rules in Brazil, and everybody was kind of shocked. That could represent the risk of opening the international structures to the Brazilian tax authorities, but now it's aligned. Everybody has more security in terms of that. And then from the destruction perspective, to your point, I mean, the private equity structures that we have in Brazil right now, when we talk about the FIP structures, for example, improves a lot the possibilities and advantages. Tayar also mentioned some. We're very used to have that, classic structure that we have often seen in Brazil. So you would have a vehicle company acquiring a target company to take advantage of the goodwill deduction with the tax shield, 5 or 10 years. But that structure had been challenged by the tax authorities in Brazil in the past. But now with the the FIP structure, for example, we can have like withholding taxes, zero on JCP, net on equity distributions, but also no capital gains on the sale of shares, which is a huge benefit for foreign investors to invest in Brazil.
No, thank you for your comments, Guilherme. I really appreciate your considerations. So let's move on, and I have a question for Pedro. Pedro, considering that the interest rate is at its lowest level, could you please comment on Brazilians' search for alternatives in portfolio diversification?
Yes. Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you for everybody to be here and for the invitation. Definitely the name of the game has been diversification for the last couple of years. The lower level of interest rates in Brazil brings the country closer to rates practiced in several other markets. This situation naturally reinforces the need and demand for increase in available assets that can be invested by investors and asset managers. The search for greater diversification of the portfolio has been accentuated either by investors or by managers who have been mobilizing themselves to identify assets capable of delivering greater or desired returns to the investors. And the benefits for the investors are very clear. The broader range of options that best suits each them terms, risks, and returns needs, and also for asset managers who have a greater diversification in composition of the portfolios, which are still very concentrated in government bonds nowadays. So it's important also to take a look from the starting point that we are taking off. The scenario we are experiencing supports the tendency that the investor will have to seek assets and investments with exposure to different markets to compose their portfolio. All of this considered, one of the priority themes on ANBIMA is the agenda of internationalization. It is important ally to the growing demand for greater investment diversification. Greater stability causes investors and managers to seek greater diversification, and overseas markets are broader and have more alternatives in terms of sector and company maturity. So this is a trend that we should continue to see for the next years for sure. Thank you.
Pedro, thank you for your comments, and I really appreciate you being here. Tayar, we have another question for you. In your opinion, what would be the main change that you would promote in the Brazilian capital markets to create a friendlier environment to encourage more IPOs in Brazil, especially for non-Brazilian investors? Could you talk a little bit with us on that?
Sure, Edu. This is a tough question. That's why I think I need a slide to go through that, because there are many things that maybe we need to improve. Well, I mean, joking aside, the financial market in Brazil, or companies will opt to go to the Brazilian stock exchange in their IPOs if there is liquidity, if there is volume investors, and that's why we need to open our market for the globe, not only Brazilian investors investing herein, right? That's why we're starting to see, for example, startups going, or tech companies going to the Brazilian market IPO. What's great. But to continue that, we need liquidity, we need global investors. For example, South American investors would be much easier for them come and invest into Brazil than maybe going to NASDAQ or to US. That should be our goal. Brazil would need to be a type of financial regional market, at least for Latin America. Why not? But there are some lessons, and we know, at least now we know exactly what we need to improve. And I think I would say that the regulators agree with that. Yeah, some of them still need to get a little deeper with the discussion with the regulators. Most of that, we don't need a law. We don't need new legislation. We just need regulation. That's easier, because then the regulator can help us on that. A few, and you see which ones, we'll need a law, and then we'll need Congress, and I mean, again, bigger stuff. So let's go through that. I think you might be seeing my slide now. And this is also, again, part of the study we did together with Ambima. So please refer to Ambima's report. It's public in Ambima's LinkedIn and links and so, or we can even, Pedro or us, we can disclose to everyone after this website, this discussion. Well, first of all, we discussed already about the new legislation Claudia mentioned, that foreign individuals will not need a second custodian to invest in Brazil. Because before, the 4373 administrator is a financial institution, will be the second custodian, in addition to the broker that also provides this service. The idea here, we're saying that, why only individuals? Why not institutional investors not needing this second broker service, right? They can do that. It's their option. Could be optional. If for any reason, for example, if they want to work with many brokers and they want, let's say, a financial institution, a bank, to consolidate the custodian for them, that's not a problem. But I don't think that should be compulsory, first of all. Second, the second item here. So just having a single register point. Nowadays, you need to send information to the central bank, information to the tax authorities, and information to CVM, the Brazilian SEC. So the discussion is, why not to have just one government platform in which you put information only once about the portfolio of the foreign investor and about also the investor himself or herself, right? And how the authorities would have access to that platform. So again, suggestion that we would be able to simplify the costs of doing business in Brazil. The third one is also linked. Nowadays, the broker has to send information to the 4373 administrator, then the administrator sends to the three authorities. Why not having the broker putting the information already in the platform for everyone to access? Again, it seems obvious, but at the same time needs some cooperation among the regulators to unify the platform for them to have access. The fourth one is a little more tricky. The 4373 administrator, it is a tax representative, but is also a legal representative. And we think the legal representativeness service, it's also obliged to represent the foreign investor in case of a crime. So if there is a financial crime, for example, inside trade information, for example, that the foreigner has access, and it cannot trade, and they did trade with inside information. The local 4373 administrator is somehow in between with this legal representative. The question is, why that? Nowadays, there are many global crimes. So, you know, for example, cybercrime, a foreign person, a hacker, can get into the Brazilian internet system and steal information, and so they don't have a representative here, and we still can prosecute them. There are other ways that a Brazilian authority can get access of a foreign investor if they do a crime and not put additional burden and cost to a local representative. So that's why we think we should deal with that and maybe simplify that. The fourth one, we are saying, maybe I'm going to talk about both of them, optional tax registering and alternative to that responsibility. I already mentioned that nowadays, a foreign investor that gets into Brazilian financial market, they can get exemption on the stock exchange for stock. They can get exemption on government bonds and so on. So the question is, if they're exempted in this market, why they need to have and pay for someone to be their tax representative and not even having a tax code? They're exempted. That's right. That's not all transactions that are exempted. But at least if the investor says that they are going to trade only in exempted transaction, why to have a tax representative? So we could have maybe two options. If they go just for the exempted ones, maybe the smaller investors, they don't need a tax representative. And if they want to trade, for example, with derivatives, with more complex transactions, then they need a tax representative. But maybe don't need to be a bank. They don't need to be such a, maybe a 4373 administrative. Could be a law firm, a bookkeeper, you know, someone that, or even the broker himself. The broker they hire could have this service, and then we don't duplicate costs. I'm going to go for the symbolic exchange. That's very simple. And I have to say that central bank has already reduced a lot of them. But nowadays, sometimes, even if you want to change portfolios, you need to do a type of a symbolic effects, such as you were sending money abroad and coming back to Brazil. What's not the case. We're just transferring inside Brazil. So we have to eliminate that. Brazilian UBO regulation, Guilherme, I think, mentioned that. Is still somehow complex. Our approach would be to put more similar to the global FATCA and CRS regulation that other countries already use as possible. So again, the market is requesting that, and tax authority has improved that, but it's still not there. And maybe the last one, and I put as last because maybe it's a more complex one, because again, might need a law again in the Congress. But basically, we have, if the investment into the Brazilian market comes through a non-tax haven, they have all the benefits I mentioned, exemptions and so. But if they come through a tax haven, they don't have. So if the investor comes from Cayman, BVI, or United Emirates, they don't get exemption in Brazil. And the question is, why? Why? I mean, the answer should be, it's true that if there are Brazilians hiding above a Cayman entity or so, then we should close the door. That's not the goal. The goal of the 4373, the benefits are for foreigners, not for Brazilian hidden, maybe through holding companies or so. That's another discussion, okay? But if it's a foreigner, if it's a US citizen that has a Cayman branch, a Cayman fund and invests in Brazil, or if it's even a sovereign wealth fund from United Emirates, why they don't have the tax benefits? Just because they are in a tax haven, but there's no difference anymore. And important to say that most countries don't give this type of difference if the money comes from a tax haven, but they have the FATCA to find if there are local citizens investing through those locations. That's not the case. So that's the type of discussions we have to improve to be able to have much more investment in Brazil and then have a big capital market here. Hopefully I didn't talk too much, Edu. Thank you, bye.
No, that's fine, Taya. That's fine. That's fine. It's okay, and we agree with your comments and with your considerations here, and we see that the same problems that you are seeing, and for sure we are working here, and BIMA is working to change the scenario that we have, and those changes will be very positive for our market. Claudia, I will allow you to do the next question.
Thanks, Edu, and thanks, Taya. Some very interesting ideas. Now, as we discussed earlier, last year, the Brazilian SEC submitted a draft resolution for the regulation of Brazilian investment funds for public hearing. The objective of the resolution is to modernize investment fund regulations, reflecting the legal innovations brought by the economic freedom law, as well as presenting other proposed changes in line with the current market. Now, Pedro, question for you. The mentioned hearing provides changes to the regulation of investment funds. Could you comment on those changes?
Yes, sure. Thank you. This is a very important milestone. This has the power to change our local industry. The economic freedom law released back in 2019 gave more clarity and created concepts to assist in the well-functioning of the industry. Now, the time has come to the rules to reflect the changes brought by the law. The broader revision of the rules related to investment funds has been awaited by the market for a long time. It's the opportunity to take a new leap towards international market practice. it's very important to emphasize that we are getting closer to the worldwide standards. The advances that are being suggested by the Brazilian SEC and by the market through contributions during the public hearing period take us to a category closer to what investors are used to find in other jurisdictions. Several tools and concepts that until now were not available to the local industry will have. This is a very good news and important advance in terms of product, understanding, and security of the investors, including the foreign investors. The main highlights of this public hearing, it brought the concept of essential service providers for the funds. Fund manager and administrator will assume co-responsibility for the constitution of the vehicle. And this is a very important change that brought recognition of the manager's role and added weight to his duties. As of now, he is a third party hired by the administrator. CVM also brought the possibility of the fund to be or to have segregated asset classes and sub-asset classes. And an asset class is a very important concept for us because one class will not share its assets with another. Each will configure a segregated portfolio. In the subclass, it will be possible to segment redemption condition, terms, management fees. So the investment fund becomes a shell with asset classes and sub-asset classes within its umbrella. Despite this advance, some adjustments need to be made so that the rule can be implemented more efficiently. The main one is related to taxation. Ambima suggested in the public hearing that classes may have different tax treatment within the same fund. It's the opportunity for the fund industries to get even closer to the existing structures in other countries, due to the potential to create optimized funds with cost reduction, in addition to the offering greater flexibility for the definition of commercial conditions within a single fund. Also, a greater exposure of funds to assets abroad. So in line of the last question about diversification, we are also proposing a broad access to exposure internationally. This is an old desire and need of our industry. Back in 2020, Ambima had already addressed suggestions of rules improvements. The draft resolution already attended one of our requests, allowing retail funds to invest up to 100% in international assets if additional requirements defined by the regulation are followed. Other suggestions that we reinforce at this moment were allowing funds for retail and qualified investors to invest up to 100% in assets that are already or may be backed by BDRs, Brazilian Depositary Receipts, such as stocks, debts, and foreign issuers and ETFs traded abroad. And also increase the general limit of investment of the funds in other assets abroad, without the need to follow additional requirements defined by the regulation. For an example, for the retail, our suggestion is to increase the limit from 20 to 40%. And for the qualifying investors, the increase from 40 to 60%. And we also propose several mechanisms for managing liquidity of the funds, such as side pockets, gates, for an example, that are widely used in the international market, but it's not the same in Brazil. Although the public hearing didn't address this issue, Ambima brought this up in our suggestions for implementation of these basically three main tools, such as side pockets, gates, and the allowance of loans, which nowadays funds are not allowed. Ambima also plans to involve in conversation with the market and the Brazilian SEC regarding swinging price, which is also another a mechanism that should help treat liquidity issues.
Thank you, Pedro. Now I have a question for Tayar again. Besides dealing with the regulatory changes in investment funds, could you address changes on the tax matters that will be positive for the investment funds industry?
Sure. Yes. I mean, there are some rules that in Brazil that applies to funds that make more complex or different than investing direct on the asset class. Some of them are better, some other are not. Two examples. As I said before, stock trading is exempt for foreign investors, but private bonds are not exempt. They have reduced rates, but are not exempt. And more than that, if a foreign investor invests in bonds and they have gain in some bonds and losses in another bond, they cannot offset one with other. However, if they do that through a fund, they can offset because they will be taxed only at the redemption of the fund. It's also good that a fund does not have comic quotas for a foreign investor. Comic quotas, for those foreigners that don't know, unfortunately, Brazilians investors, if they invest in a local fund, I have a type of a deemed distribution every 6 months, and I pay taxes regardless if I get any cash from the fund on the accrued income every 6 months. What sometimes makes not as good for me invest through a fund in comparison to invest directly. But at least for foreigners, they don't have that. So that's just some difference to say that already exists. But one of the key issues that I think we should improve to benefit Brazil being a type of a regional hub for foreign investors into Latin America would be if, for example, a foreign investor from out the world can come into a Brazilian fund, and this Brazilian fund could invest in Argentina, Chile, Peru, Mexico, through Brazil. That would be great, wouldn't it? It is possible. Yes, it is. But Brazilian funds, unfortunately, do not give tax credit on any taxes paid on those other countries to the investor of the Brazilian fund. This is not the best way to go, because if it's a real estate fund and you receive, let's say, lease for a property and there is a withholding tax on that lease, unfortunately, you don't get a credit when you get your money out of the Brazilian fund that invested in that Argentinian property. Or if you buy stock, even, let's say, stock in US, and there is withholding dividend, as we know, this withholding dividend cannot be credited back by the investor into the Brazilian fund that received that dividend. So we've been working and we are trying to get the Brazilian authorities to somehow create a scheme to give a credit, a tax credit, not to have Brazil double taxing any investment through a Brazilian fund if we want to become a hub for a regional investment. I think that I would stay for here, and maybe if people has other questions, we could come back. There are many ideas. I mean, even on the FIPI, for example, I think Guilherme and Pedro mentioned about that. There are some improvements, but I can comment that later on the next questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tayar, for your comment. And you're right. In order to the Brazilian vehicles to access investments overseas, some we need to change something. We need to change some way that we tax in order to do this more easily and to provide and to do this in a more efficient way. So even with the economic crisis caused by COVID-19, the fintech, let's go to the fintech world, the fintech industry experienced the best year in the story in terms of investment. The industry that received the most investments in 2020 was digital services, around 1 billion, almost 85% increase compared to the previous year. In second position were credit fintechs at 10%, almost 11%, growth compared to 2019. Another category that stood out was the payment industry in third place. The change in the amount of investment received in the payment industry compared to 2019 was impressive. This can be explained by several factors, such as online payments becoming more popular, expansion of digital wallets, and the arrival of Pix. So, Guilherme, I have a question for you. What are the expectations, in your opinion, for 2021 with the possible recovery and normalization of our economy regarding fintechs? With new tools such as open banking and Pix, is it possible that fintech sector will become more competitive and attractive to investment? Could you please comment on that, Guilherme?
Sure, Eduardo. Well, definitely very high expectations for 2021, 2022, especially in the financial market in Brazil. I mean, we have seen this blooming in the fintechs, and it's really aligned with the open banking concepts and open investment, local developments, and with the focus in offering an investment advisory approach, and with more high-tech technological platforms. I think this concept of opening bank, it is something new in Brazil, something that here in the US very common, but the fact that the client has the ownership of its own history of credit and data, it really provides a lot of flexibility to the client to look and eventually changing the financial institution that the clients used to work with. We also have the great success of XP Investimentos XP that for sure open many doors for smaller players because they can offer more tech-based approaches, more tailored services, and this also provides more flexibility to clients. And then, of course, we have to mention Pix. That definitely increases also the competitiveness for the payment industry. We have seen big players like Visa and MasterCard, pretty much having most of the market share, but now they will have to really, differentiate their approaches and in the payment market to be able to actually keep the market share they currently have.
Thank you, Guilherme.
Thank you.
Let's keep on this topic. The Brazilian foreign exchange regulation dates back, as I said to you all in the presentation, from the early 50s. Its rules have negative impact on imports, exports, investments, and free circulation of capital. In that sense, Bill of Exchange is being discussed as a manner to consolidate laws and decrees, as well as to modernize and bring the exchange system closer to developed. So, given this scenario and take into account the new proposals, what are the main impacts for foreign investors in Brazil that you could see?
Right, Eduardo. We have this bill, the 5387, that for sure brings several new possibilities for investors to invest in Brazil, especially with respect to the foreign currency market and the ability to keep foreign bank accounts. But also we have to mention the trends in Brazil that to align with the OECD guidelines that brings more security when you think about the transfer pricing perspective. And overall, I mean, an investor here from the US, for example, looking at investments in Brazil or other countries that do not have this trend to align with OECD, Brazil, of course, would be more attractive. I think we have to keep track, and for sure, US investors are following this very closely. The indirect taxes, they're being in the discussion. There's several bills in Brazil under discussion. We know how relevant indirect taxes in Brazil are. So eventually reassessing the current structure and reevaluating, reshaping the way the structure it is in Brazil to take advantage of that. Another big one is the taxation of dividends. That actually it's more than just the taxation of dividend. I think it's more Brazil adopting a system that it's been working well in our neighbor Chile, that you have a 2-layer of taxations, right? So you do have the first layer, and then you tax the dividend, and that allows Brazil to get closer to OECD corporate income tax rate, something between, I don't know, maybe 20, 28. That makes a lot of difference. I mean, bottom line, when the investors are looking at different countries from the private equity perspective, they would be doing like a business model and looking at the returns. And if you have a 34 corporate income tax rate, with while most countries are, getting aligned with OECD, it's not advantage. So the fact that we're now discussing this dividend taxation in Brazil, it's very well seen. It also it's common that when you're looking at investment or coming for a country for the first time, you don't expect to be paying dividends in the first 2 to 4 years because you're still doing more capex investment. So having this additional incentive for the investors to keep reinvesting is really relevant. What we have right now is the JCP, the net on equity, that works to some extent in that way, because if you keep the money there in Brazil on equity, you can have a lower taxation of 15% compared to 34 on that interest. But definitely having this 2-layer of taxation is a big change for Brazil.
Thank you, Guilherme. Thank you. Tayar, do you have any comments on this new scenario for fintechs and so on?
Well, I mean, as you know, I'm working a lot with startups, with fintechs nowadays. Specifically, I'm supporting a senior advisor, one fintech from Silicon Valley that want to come to Brazil. And from Brazil, not from Brazil, but also in parallel going to Europe and so. I have to say that the Brazilian regulation improved a lot. The Brazilian fintech payments, for example, regulation, credit regulation for fintechs, it's easier than the European one, for example. We can start to do payments up to a certain level, volume, even before getting the approval of the central bank. What's great. It's not the case in Europe. If you do $1,000 in Europe of payments before the license, you are doing a crime. It was not the case in Brazil. So I would say that we improved a lot. Even again, when we were in PwC, I remember that we provided a type of a study report on fintechs. And the very next day it was made public, the central bank called us and said, "Can you come here tomorrow?" And we said, well, I mean, I think we did something wrong. Central bank is calling us. And that's not true. They said, well, it's great what you did, the research. Can you help us to improve even more the regulation? So I think that's a comment that I have to make, that Brazilian Central Bank, it's improved a lot with all these peaks, open banking, the credit, the payments regulation. We do have a good scenario for that. And that's why our fintechs are going global, right? Our fintechs are unicorns, all of them.
Yeah, this is something that we are doing really well between several others, but that's good. I fully agree with you. That's the reason why our fintechs is going abroad and becoming unicorns. We have several types of them and several companies to say the names here. So thank you, Tayar, for your comments. So let's go to the last questions to our participants, and after we go to the audience questions. Pedro, the next question will be for you. Unfortunately, we are almost in the end of our event. It's related to specs. This is even terms for songs and so on in the US. The special purpose acquisition companies, the specs, have become a preferred way for many experienced management teams and sponsors to take companies public. A spec raises capital through IPO for the purpose of acquiring an existing operating company. Subsequently, the operating company can merge with the spec and become a listed company instead of executing its own IPO. Pedro, how do you see the spec movement in Brazil? Could you comment a little bit for us?
Yes, sure. Thank you. The growth in the number of specs in the US and the possibility of creating this product in Brazil stimulated the formation of a working group at Ambima to discuss the topic. Discussion started about 2 months ago. As it's a very complex structure, it still requires further study before we can present any results. The working group is composed by several institutions and has the support of a local and a North American legal office. Recently, CVM opened a public hearing to review the public offering rules. This audience opened the possibility to include topics such as this. So the idea is that the association evaluation or study on specs will be presented in our response to the regulator. This is another possibility of a public offering structure for our market. So this is something that we are looking at, and probably we will propose some ideas to CVM in order for the industry to have the possibility of having specs here in Brazil.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you very much for your answer, for your comment. Just would like to know, feel free, Guilherme and Tayar, if you want to comment on that. So we can go to the questions from the audience. I think we have a few questions, right, Claudia?
Yeah, we actually have quite a few questions, so apologies due to the time constraints. We need to select and answer just a few. So the first one is from Felipe to you, Edu. Why are there no qualified intermediaries in Brazil?
First, thank you for your question. I really appreciate your participation here. We do have, but the problem here is the long path that we have to be in compliance with to access the Brazilian capital market. As we could see during our presentation, we need several steps to be in compliance with before access the market here. We need to simplify that. We need to make it easier. So making it easier, we can change changing the regulatory aspects, and also to make it easier, we have also to change the tax aspects that we have here. So the market here in Brazil, they are doing efforts to do that, and little by little we are getting there. But we have this type of intermediaries in Brazil. That's it. Thank you for your question. Claudia, another question here?
Yes, indeed. from Jefferson, I believe from PwC, to Tayar this time. While the wave of new IPOs might bring good beta investments, alternative asset classes like private credit, private debt, and securitization vehicles might bring even better returns. From the tax burden on fund structuring perspective, would a foreign investor have different benefits investing in one asset class versus the others mentioned above?
All right, well, sure. My friend Jefferson Oliveira from Luxembourg, in fact, he has a lot of investors looking into Brazil, and for sure, I mean, it would be great to be able to offer great tax benefits for private investments in Brazil, but unfortunately, it's not so easy. As I said, if you trade stock in the stock exchange, you're tax-free. But for example, if you trade as angel into a crowdfunding private shares of a startup, a small entity that really needs foreign investors, you are not exempted because you are not coming to the 4373. You are coming to the 4131 law that don't have any benefits for tax investors, believe it or not. So the only way that a foreign investor gets into the Brazilian market, into private assets, and gets some benefits is the FIPE, the private equity fund that was mentioned before. But still, the FIPE is more complex. You know, first of all, to get the exemption, you cannot hold more than 40% of the FIPE, right? There is some cost to manage the FIPE. So that's why we still think there are space to improvements, such as the mini IPOs, maybe a regulation that can allow small investors into crowdfunding, get also some exemption up to a certain level, certain amount maybe. So there are space to improvement. But just coming, as Jefferson mentioned, other type of assets as well. My answer was more on the private stock. But for example, private bonds, as I said before, generally they are not exempt. There are some exceptions. If you go into some, let's say, long-term project financing, some of the infrastructure financing, you can get some exemption being a foreign investor into a private bond, but not all of them, and it's also complex. So, I mean, I didn't comment on the SPAC question, Eduardo, but maybe some type of legislation that allows the use of a SPAC to be able to get into the private companies in a type of IPOing, listing these private companies in a less costly way could be an option to give the tax benefits to the foreign investor, or maybe a more easy way to come into Brazilian FIPs or in the Brazilian crowdfunding, being considered a mini IPO to give also the tax benefit to the foreign investor when they are improving the Brazilian small private companies.
So, Tayar, our environment is changing, our business are changing, and all the companies that we have here in Brazil, they are changing, and now we need to finance companies that they are not SAs. We need to finance companies that they are starting. So everything that we are discussing here are related. It's related to how to make it easier to the companies that in fact are needing, and they are bringing solutions to us. They are needing resources now. So this is good. It's good to the market. It's good for the market. We have this type of discussion, and it's good for the market that the regulatory and association, there is regulatory in associations that are discussing these types of topics. I think it is important not only for the financial market, but for the economy as a whole. So thank you, Tayar. So do we have another question?
Just a comment here, sorry, just a comment here, maybe, sorry. I don't want to be neither too positive or too negative. I think we are in a very good shape. We do have a great economy, huge market, potential post-COVID. As I said before, the fintech regulations. I mean, we do have a lot of opportunities to make money in Brazil, huge unicorns, right? So the issue is that we just need to solve some bureaucratic and maybe some small pieces of legislation to really boom our market. But again, for investor, you have two options. Either you wait for that, but you might come too late, or you start to get knowledge about Brazil. You start to get information about Brazil. You start to invest and learn about Brazil now, and maybe follow on these small pieces of improvements we still have to make, and we hope we're going to make very soon. And Bima is helping a lot on that. PwC is working on that. And as soon as that's cleared, you should be already here and should already know about Brazil to be on board and not lose the train and make a lot of money in Brazil. So I'm positive. I mean, it's a positive message that I would like to be.
We are, Tayar. I'm positive as well, and I fully agree with you. We can, for sure, at some moment, all the change we're gonna happen. But now, it's a very good moment to access the Brazilian financial market. So why not? We have several ways of structuring this type of investments in Brazil. So that's a positive scenario. I fully agree with you. Pedro, Guilherme, any other comments? Okay.
Thanks.
We can go. Okay, we can go to the next question, Claudia. Do we have another question?
Yeah, a final question for today from to you again, Edu, and we had to select this one. What can PwC Brazil do to help a foreign investor to enter into the Brazilian capital market?
So that is a very good question. That's a very good question, Meryl. We can help in several ways, from the beginning until the end of the lifetime of the fund. We can help with the structuring, we can help with projections, we can help with outsourcing, regulatory and tax compliance, we can help with permanent consulting, IPOs, audit service. And audit service is not only for the funds here in Brazil. PwC Brasil, it's allowed by PCOB to audit funds outside Brazil in some jurisdiction. So there are several types of services that we can provide in order to help the foreign investors to access the Brazilian market. So thank you for the question. I really appreciate that. And just to remember, and this is a notice for Jefferson, our friend that's watching us from Luxembourg. This session will be recorded, and please access later if you need. Thank you all for your time here. Thank you for the speakers, Tayar, Pedro, and Guilherme. Thank you, Claudia, and thank you for my team that are helping us with that, Carolina, Thiago, Vitor, Amanda, and Mariana. Thank you all. I hope you all appreciate the time here, and we are here to help. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night.